Hello everyone, and welcome to the Green Room today. My name's Rob Wilson. I'm an Exec Director at the CFC and Head of Resources, so look after what we do in that space. I'm joined here today by Nicole Roocke, who is the CEO of the Minerals Research Institute of Western Australia. I'll refer to it as MRIWA. She will probably not like it, but we're here to talk about the report that we published recently jointly around mining in a low emissions economy and the compelling case for decarbonisation. Before we get into that, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Whadjuk Noongar, and to pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Before we get started, just a little bit of housekeeping. You should have a little box on the left-hand side of your screen in which you can submit any questions, and time permitting, we'll get to all of those. We're going to have a conversation probably for around half an hour and then around 15 minutes for those questions and answers. So why don't we get started? The CFC has been looking at the resource sector for around 5 years now. For the most part, those opportunities have focused on decarbonisation initiatives, renewable energy, low emission type technologies and things of that ilk. And one of the early forays, our solar and storage team were involved with the Degrissa mine with funding the solar and batteries there. More recently, we've been looking at the clean energy minerals supply chain, really the critical minerals that are associated with the energy transition. And probably the most pertinent opportunity there was Pilbara Minerals, who we were involved with from around 2016 onwards, and are still involved with at this point in time. And then more recently, we've been looking at mining technology. What can we do to help with some of the technologies that will assist decarbonise mining? And a recent transaction announced about a week ago was putting some money into RCF Jollymon's Mining Innovation Fund number 2. So we see that as a very important way to assist the mining sector decarbonise. Remote communities and remote mines are really at the forefront of the energy transition in the stationary energy space, and they're dealing with a lot of the technical issues and moving very quickly. So probably at the forefront of a lot of that clean tech. And my suspicion is that the grids will be learning from the way that mines and remote communities actually integrate technology. So this is something that's of great interest to us. We've seen some really good examples of high penetration renewables starting to flow through in the mining sector. And I guess through our work, we've also seen though that there are these pools of great knowledge, and then there wider views where people yet haven't fully understood the potential of the technology. So that's caused us to reflect on what we can do to help spread that word. And about midway through last year, we had a conversation with Nicole and realised they were also grappling with exactly the same topic. That was shortly before the very first zero emissions mining conference, which was held, I think, September last year. So I think, and that led us to team up on the report that was published earlier this month. Nicole, I might just hand it to you then to sort of talk through your journey around decarbonisation and why it is you're looking at it.
Thanks, Robin. Great to be here today, and thanks for everyone for joining us for this conversation. We, as an organisation, started a conversation about 2 years ago looking at what net zero emission mining meant and what some of the challenges were and what were some of the long-term research solutions that were needed to enable it to happen. And we have a group of subject matter experts called our college, and we held a workshop with them, and that had representatives on it from industry, from the research community, some people who are on boards of smaller mining companies, and you touched on the varied levels of understanding, and that was certainly something that came across in our discussions at our workshop, was that some people were talking about the Goldfields story. And there were other people in the room who were sitting there going, well, what have Goldfields done in this space? And of course, that led us to really decide that we couldn't assume that people knew what was possible in a decarbonised world for the mining sector, and that there was a need to be able to look at what we could do to bring people along on that journey, to challenge what they thought was or wasn't possible, and to be able to build a common understanding across the sector. So Robert, I know you touched on the DeGrussa mine, and that was over 5 years ago. What's your views in terms of how you've seen those goalposts and standards change over time?
I think what's really surprised me is the pace of the change, and we started engaging with some of the IPPs probably 2 or 3 years ago now around how could we assist them with this renewables task. And I think at that point in time, the views were still, well, we'd rather stick with baseload for the most part, and those that were doing it were looking at relatively low levels of renewable energy integration. What's really amazed me is over the last 2 years how that's accelerated, and we were talking 20 to 30%. A lot of the guys now, a lot of the mines are talking about 50% as the norm, and the more adventurous and the more ambitious are talking about 65, 70, 75, and I've even seen targets into the 90%. Now, we sort of acknowledge that it gets harder and harder as you move up that spectrum, but the ambition is there. I think the technologies are coming on in leaps and bounds, and the ambitious miners are really targeting that, setting new standards, and that appeals to us. As you know, we have limited capital, so what we can do, we like to assist those that are setting new standards, and those new standards become the norm.
Yeah, and I think certainly for us, one of the reasons we're wanting to partner with yourselves on this publication series was to actually look at how do we provide resources to those that recognise there's a need to have a conversation, recognise there's a need to do things differently, and be able, but don't necessarily have the resources of some of the larger organisations to unpack what a starting point might be, and to look at how do we produce a set of resources that could be used to support people develop that common understanding, and start moving beyond kind of the unknown at this point in time.
And I think it was, it might be interesting to get your views. If I look at what we've actually produced relative to what we thought we were going to produce, they're very different. What's your perspective? Have you had any feedback, positive or negative, on that?
Yeah, so I think we all went into this conversation thinking that it would be a simple and easy opportunity to compile information and a summary of what was possible, and to be able to demonstrate and provide a framework for people to be able to look at how to take the conversation forward. And certainly our observation was, and the more we got into it and working with ONG Impact to be able to deliver this piece of work, was that it was a far more complex conversation, and that once you started moving beyond just consideration of electrification and decarbonisation of the energy solution, that there was a need for us to be able to break the work up into separate components. There was certainly that easy to read overview snapshot piece of work, which I think was where we started off thinking what we would produce. But actually when we looked at what we'd compiled and what ONG Impact had compiled in relation to the technology solutions along the mining value chain, as well as being able to demonstrate something in practice with our Zero mine, Project Zero, that we needed to break it up into digestible reports that actually gave a framework of how people could progress in the conversation.
Yeah, I really like the approach in taking the heat maps type approach, and don't want to get into the detail of that, but just understanding the full breadth of technologies that are out there, their level of development, and then trying to distill it down into what is most applicable from a decarbonisation perspective. So some interesting outcomes in that, and I'm hoping that, you know, this assists the market to understand that sector better. What were your key takeaways on that?
Yeah, I think some of the challenges in looking at this as a single topic is needing to recognise that a lot of these conversations are actually context specific. That, you know, being able to look at and identify what the operating context of an organisation are, what the downstream processing ambitions are, what the ambitions of organisations around targets, that there's a need to give consideration of all of those aspects of things, and then within that to then look at what the range of technology solutions are. And I think, you know, some people are talking about that there's only one or two different options for technology solutions, but actually the more you look into things, actually there are a range of technology solutions. And I think there's not going to be a cookie cutter approach for every mining operation to be able to decarbonise going forward. So I think you know, one of the key takeaways for me in the conversation is actually there's stuff that is possible today, and the important thing is how do companies identify, you know, what their emissions profile is and what their you know, energy use is, and actually just get on and do some of the stuff that is actually possible today, while the technology solutions for some of the harder to abate parts of the sector are developed and progressed. And I think we were talking earlier, and you were talking about the need to have a span of solutions in terms of being able to address where emissions are produced in operations.
Yeah, I think that's it. I think the mining sector and remote type solutions, there's no single solution, and there will be several technologies required, and the integration of those is obviously the key. And I think we have a lot of specialists who look at one particular technology, and I had a conversation this morning with a colleague, and in our application here in the resources sector, it is about how do we get more of these technologies together, and what might not look like a particularly appealing conversation in a grid type application is actually quite appealing in a remote type application. So you know, understanding that, understanding those different solutions, and then probably the big thing in mining is that it's not just about the stationary energy. It's about the you know, the different fuels that are used. It's about the in-mine operations, the processing, and the haulage as well. I think we tend to focus on the stationary energy, but we also need to be looking at all of the others. Some of them are challenging. What have you learned through this process?
So with the energy solution, I think, as you indicated, that will get people a significant way down the pathway to decarbonise. There's now proven technologies, there's now proven deployment at scale to be able to deploy solar and wind generation. I think the next evolution and phase of development, and there's already significant work and investment happening looking at what these storage solutions are, And I think those storage solutions will actually vary depending on where the operations are, whether they're on-grid or off-grid, like you touched on. In some locations, they might be able to consider a hydro-powered solution. In other locations, they are going to need to look at a battery solution to be able to shift in time, shift the energy from when it's generated to when it actually needs to be used. And while we have fantastic solar and wind assets, that's variable, and that brings with it some real challenges for the industry to be able to continue their 24/7 operations. But also then it becomes a conversation about, well, how do we progress further into the different fuel types. You touched on material movement before. That's areas that we are going to need to look at some existing solutions, but we're also going to need to fundamentally rethink some of the things like our mine design. The mine design of today under an electrified world will need to change, and so part of the challenge going forward is how do we create models of that, how do we test that, and how do we test it at scale, and I think that's where some of the opportunities with CEFC, pushing those boundaries and lifting those standards will be able to help demonstrate some of those opportunities.
You touched on storage. I might just sort of go back to that. I think it's obviously one of the big challenges for mine site is how do you shift daytime energy into nighttime energy. Interesting angles, I guess. We're starting to see more flow battery type applications coming out. I've been surprised that we haven't seen more of vanadium flow batteries being applied in the mining sector yet, but it does start to, certainly from what I'm hearing, parties are starting to think about this. Are you hearing much on that?
We're certainly increasingly seeing the opportunity that comes from the vanadium redox flow batteries through the Future Battery Industry, CRC. We're involved with a number of research projects that are seeking to trial different battery types in a mining operation. To be able to understand how those batteries perform in what can be quite hostile environments. There are some battery types that just aren't suited to being in a high heat, high temperature environment. But equally, I think, with some of the different battery technologies, is also looking at what's needed to be able to bring down the input costs of some of those technologies, and I think which goes to the point we were talking earlier about actually how it's not just about how mining needs to decarbonise, but the opportunity for the mining sector as the supplier of commodities to be able to enable those clean energy technologies, and the real conundrum that exists over how do they decarbonise themselves as well as then supply clean, green minerals and commodities to enable those clean energy technologies as well. And do you see that's going to influence the ability of companies to access finance going forward? To what degree they decarbonise themselves?
Oh, very much. I think the finance markets are looking to be able to fund green and responsible assets. So I think that's been happening now for a while, and I can only see it accelerating. I think the resource sector is unfairly penalised in a bunch of areas already, if you look at, I saw some interesting research only last week around the challenge in terms of the total energy transition that's out there, and really sort of brings it home that, we've only just started on the transition. I think currently the statistic I saw was that only around 12% of total energy is now renewable on a global basis, and all of that fossil fuel-based stuff ultimately will need to be transitioned over the next 30 to 50 years. But where does that come from? Well, it's going to come from renewable energy equipment ultimately, and that's going to require various minerals. So I think we're at the start of something that will have a sort of a medium to long-term trend in the resources sector, and we need to be able to find ways to finance that. And that will be a significant capital requirement over the next while.
The size and scale of the energy needs of the sector are significant, and I know the West Australian state government have publicly stated their ambition to retire the state-owned coal-fired power stations by 2030. I know there's certainly, in the context of that on-grid, off-grid environment, what the state here in Western Australia, what the state government do to look to supply renewable energy has direct impacts for those that draw on the grid. So there's certainly work happening within the state government to look at how did they, within the areas that they have control, to look to decarbonise, to then support the mining sector achieve that and supply greener energy into the market. So, but that scale of investment is going to be significant, and I think grappling with what that means is, and getting an understanding of what that means is going to be a key part of the learning journey that everyone needs to go on in the context of this conversation.
So that probably sounds a little daunting, if you're a miner out there, but might be worthwhile actually touching about the sort of the process that miners should go through, those that haven't already kicked off in terms of looking at this, and we touched on it earlier. So understanding your own emissions profile, setting technology priorities, coming up with an implementation plan, and then executing on that, and their timelines. You've already mentioned there's a lot of stuff that can be done now. Do you want to expand on that?
Yeah, and I think when we worked with ONG Impact to look at, rather than just having this be a paper that talked about the technologies and presented a framework, looking at actually having a model mine that we could test some of the different technologies and some of the solutions on. And the approach that was taken with regards to that is looking at what those three possible phases of rolling out the solutions could be, with really the first phase being, what can you do today? There's existing technologies that are low risk and no regret opportunities that can be rolled out today. And we had the other week at our Net Zero Emission Mining Conference was Darren from Horizon Power speaking. And one of the things that really struck me about his as one of the conversations and was put to him was what's next, and his response was, well, we just need to get on and do something and start doing the time for doing another feasibility study isn't now, that there's actually known benefits and the economics are there to be able to do stuff today. Then with that second phase of work is actually then looking at what might be the collaboration opportunities to find the technology solutions for the next phase of what's needed. There's work happening in the mining sector around alternative solutions for material movements. There's work happening, collaborations happening in the mining companies over electrification of the mining haul truck fleet. And I think those solutions are going to be here in the near term. Sorry, they're not things that are now 10 years off. But they're then that third phase are those activities that are technically challenging, that actually either require carbon in the mineral processing technology or require high heat, high sustained heat, that can't necessarily be generated through electrification. And I think they're then the third phase of considerations that are actually the longer term technical solutions that need to be found, and other kinds of things that my organisation is interested in knowing about and is interested in working with industry to be able to help de-risk some of that research so that we can find those technical solutions to enable a mining operation to become fully net zero.
And I think that, just touching on what you're talking about there, there's the spread of technologies, whether it's in haulage or stationary energy or processing, there's a spread of technologies and at different levels of technical and commercial readiness. It's really imperative to work out which of those can be applied and within which timeline. And then focus on the stuff that is deliverable now. So acknowledging that, there may not be commercially ready solutions, in some areas for the next while, but they are progressing.
And there are still some challenges that do need to be addressed, things like land tenure for some of these renewable energy solutions to be able to be deployed. The state government is looking at and consulting on various diversification leases for Crown land at the moment, recognising that the deployment of renewable energy solutions actually brings with it some potential competing land use opportunities. How do we make decisions about what land can be used for renewable energy solutions, taking into account future prospectivity? Are some of the, I think, challenges, but also understanding the footprint of some of these, the solar farms that are going to be required, and how do we manage the footprint and the impact of that. And again, for us as an organisation, I think it's about looking at, what's the question about how do we make solar panels more productive? Why do they have to be the size and scale that they are today? And what's needed to be able to reduce the footprint but maintain the same productivity? And they are, I think, all exciting journeys that are and conversations that are going to be unpacked over the next 5 to 10 years.
Do you see any of those as impediments in the short term, though? And I'm thinking there around land tenure, for example, where sometimes renewable energy you're typically putting down 20-year assets. The challenge is when you have much shorter mine lives. How do you then monetize an asset, and particularly if it has a regional application?
And I think that's where there needs to be some changes in industry in terms of how they look at energy solutions for their own operations. I think there's more agile ways, not necessarily of creating large interconnected systems, but actually how do you create smaller microgrids within a group of companies so that the footprint of the renewable energy solution can be minimised, and that multiple neighbours can be able to draw or get supply of energy solutions from other third parties, rather than needing to be their own owner-operators in every single circumstance. And that will require industry to think about things differently. But I don't.
Talking about collaboration, yeah.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Far more collaboration and partnership arrangements with other possible third-party suppliers. Again, to do a call out, I know there's some people who are joining up today from Energy Policy WA who have been looking at what in remote mining operations, looking at providing resources around power purchasing agreements and arrangements. And so there's a range of support being provided by the state government to look at what are those different solutions that can be done to enable the decarbonisation. So I don't think they're barriers. I do think they're challenges. I think they're very real challenges. But I do think there's a preparedness to try on behalf of all parties to find solutions. And if I think about between our conference last year and our conference this year, the level of sophistication in the discussion has lifted enormously, and that is in part because people are looking at what the challenges are and then trying to find solutions to them, as opposed to going, "Oh, it's all too hard, we can't go there."
Yeah. Before we're nearly at time, but before we switch to questions, but one of the other things that I've observed is the sort of convergence of technologies, and conversation we were having earlier around is, for example, in haulage, do we end up moving back to far smaller vehicles used in haulage because they're easier to electrify? The drivers for going largely to reduce the manpower requirements. And if you go smaller, it's easier to electrify and for autonomous control. So, do you have views on that? Are you seeing anything from a research perspective coming out of that?
We've certainly been hearing for a while of the intention or the opportunity for industry to look at moving to a smaller haul truck fleet, and that in part is being driven by the power to weight ratio needed, and with electrification that becomes much harder to have a larger haul fleet. But it also enables a bit more redundancy in organisations as well. And I think that is just one example of how the industry is going to need to basically challenge every aspect of what they do and why they do it, and why we have landed and why we do things the current way. And is there an alternative way to do it? And that, bigger's not necessarily better, doesn't any longer. And that to be more agile and nimble and flexible. I think that was one of the key insights that came out of the publication, was how do you create your operations so that as technologies change and become commercially ready, you have the flexibility and understanding of what your asset replacement schedule is, so that you are positioned to be able to embrace those new technologies as they come along.
Exactly. So before we switch to Q&A, a couple of bullet points from you in terms of what our mining viewers should do or think.
So my, I guess my key takeaways from the work is understand what your emissions profile are, understand in the first instance where your energy use is, and by doing that you're well positioned to look at where the opportunities for your organisations are, but also just to get on and start embracing and rolling out some of those solutions. We've certainly heard from some companies that even by just doing those first two activities of understanding their emissions profile and energy efficiency and energy use, they're able to identify energy efficiencies and are already getting productivity and gains in the organisation, and as part of that, then you're in a position to make more informed decisions around where to next. What about yourself, Rob? What are your key takeaways?
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. There's a lot that can be done right now, and it makes economic sense. I was having a conversation with a managing director yesterday, actually, of a mining company, and we were talking renewable energy, and they're implementing something, and is viewed as this is about to be commissioned, and we're really going to be increasing because it makes so much commercial sense.
Yeah.
Now they're in the lucky position; they have a reasonable amount of cash at hand, and they can do that. But I think that's one of the key items. There's so much that can be done right now. I think the other aspect is if you are looking at building a new mine, you need to start thinking ahead, because some of these technologies may impact the way you should be designing, particularly your infrastructure, and they may actually reduce a lot of the spend that you require on a lot of that. So, get your head around it and start thinking these things through, and build that sort of short, medium-term, long-term profile with the ambition to get to zero.
Yeah.
Well, that's probably a good point to switch to the questions that are coming in, and here's a good one for you. It says, is a net zero world an existential threat to the mining sector, in that they either have to get on board with cutting emissions, or they won't have a role in the economy of the future? I think that's a fairly easy one. But,
and I think, so I would flip that to see this is an amazing opportunity for the mining sector if they choose to embrace it. It's an opportunity for the sector to be able to demonstrate how they are a key enabler for the world to be able to meet the Paris Agreement targets, and that they're also in a position to be able to demonstrate what is possible at scale if they in terms of clean energy, deployment of clean energy technologies, thereby creating a market for the clean energy technologies that their commodities are the inputs for. I think there is a bit of a conundrum at this point in time where the demand, you look at some of the demand figures for some of the commodities that are needed for, whether it be for solar panels or for wind turbines, and that demand is staggeringly large, and it's hard to see how that supply is going to happen. And how mining companies are, in parallel to supplying those commodities, going to decarbonise their own operations as well. And I think that's where things like financial markets and things like communities and regulators are really going to be looking for what are the transition plans, so that not only can we supply the minerals and the commodities, but that we can also decarbonise ourselves. And, the people sound really old here, youth of today, but it's not actually just youth of today. People's values are changing, and people want to be part of organisations whose values align with their own values, and often those values are aligned with how do we address climate, what is the climate action that's needed. And so companies that are able to clearly demonstrate that will, I think, be able to be employers of choice going forward. So I don't see it's an existential crisis. I see it's an amazing opportunity for the mining sector.
Well, yeah, I think it's more than an opportunity, though. It's a must, because the energy transition doesn't happen without it when you look at those multiples of volume that are needed. But touching on that, your last point, it feels as though, as the mining sector, we need to be portraying a far better image as well in order to attract the skills. And I'm thinking in the financing sector, we need to be attracting people into financing resources as well. Yeah. So, and I think the commercial banks are facing challenges in that space as we speak. So it is a challenge for all of us. But next question: how realistic is it for miners to get to net zero? Would this be by 2050, or what later date? And I think that's a very mine-specific question.
Yeah.
Do you want to...
I think that is a really mine-specific question, but I also think the project Mine Zero that we had in our series of reports that ONGI did the testing on, it was certainly showing that with current technologies in that phase one, there's significant opportunities to be achieved in the near term. And that really looking at the electrification pathway that was included as one of the 4 pathways for decarbonisation is that it, in theory, is going to be possible by 2040, and that then, you know, provides sufficient time to get a return on investment for mines that have a longer operating life of mine. Doesn't mean it's going to be easy, doesn't mean we have all of the technology solutions today, but I think the commitment that is being made and the level of investment into activities today, I don't think it's going to be easy, but I do think we're going to make significant progress, certainly by 2030 and definitely by 2040.
There's a question here around whether did we look overseas at other mining operations for the report, and I think it's the range of case studies. I think we tried to look as far and wide as we could, and ONGI were able to access a bunch of case studies. I think we all used our own knowledge as well. But any particular highlights there that?
Look, we were certainly wanting to showcase what was happening in Western Australia, being a very parochial West Australian organisation. There are certainly some fantastic examples here in the state. There are some lessons and learnings that certainly were taken from other places around Western Australia, but there are other examples certainly globally that we did, and we know ONGI looked at to inform some of the solutions, and in some places they actually have access to hydro power, which will make it far easier for some of our direct competitors to be able to decarbonise their operations and to have access to more reliable, consistent, renewable energy solutions. So we certainly did look broader, further afield. We're aware that a number of the companies and the trials that they're doing, particularly with some of the haulage solutions, while they're West Australian companies or Australian companies, the trials are actually being done overseas, so we've needed to look at those. But what we really want to be able to do is champion to Western Australian operations and to Australian operations about what can we do today and what is happening today, rather than going, it's only happening overseas and we've got to wait until overseas sort it before we import it. I want us to lead the conversation and to find those solutions, those harder to answer solutions that are needed.
Yeah, that's certainly from my side an observation is that from an Australian mining perspective, I think it's a competitive advantage if we can be really cleaning up and putting ourselves forward as having clean supply chains. It sets us apart globally. So, something I'm reasonably passionate about, I think. The next question here, and it might be our last, judging by time, is miners have very big capital costs and long lead times. Does this make it harder for them to decarbonise than they're already doing? And should we just expect new mines to be low carbon?
Yeah, and that's a really interesting question. I can remember the call when ONGI Impact were putting forward what the model mine would look like, and their first, I think one of the first conversations was, well, let's look at a greenfield copper mine in remote Western Australia, and posing the question to going, but in some regards, greenfield's easier because greenfields you can You might not have necessarily all the solutions in terms of mine design, but you can plan for that. One of the biggest challenges is then how do you get access to the capital? But by considering a brownfield site, and if it can be achieved on a brownfield site in a remote location that's already got a lot of sunk capital, and it can be shown that you can get a return on investment, then it can be done anywhere. And I don't think we can only assume that this should happen, decarbonisation should happen in greenfield sites, because if that's the case, then it's going to be 20, 30 years before we actually see material change in the mining sector, and I don't think we can wait for that to happen. I think companies have asset replacement schedules. Yes, there's a lot of sunk capital in the haulage fleet, but the haulage fleet, some companies change out every 5 to 7 years. So there's no reason why they can't. They might have just made an investment in all of their new haulage fleet, but they can certainly start the planning for their next cycle of asset replacements to look at what do they need to be able to electrify the mining operation, so that the next time they purchase haulage equipment, that it can be electrified. So I think that's the way that we can see a responsible and economic transition in brownfields operations that have lots of sunk capital.
And I think we could unpack that a lot further, but I think we'd be running over fairly substantially. But it's been a pleasure having you here, and I've got to say, great pleasure working with the MRIWA team and also with Energy Impact on this report. So thanks very much for that. Look forward to collaborating further going forward. Also, I want to say thanks to everybody who's dialed in, appreciate you doing so. There will be another green room shortly on the grid on the 27th of October, so please register for that. And the recording of this webinar will be available in the next day or so. Also, to any of those who would like to, we'd very much like you to complete a survey after this, and look forward to having you at the next green room. Thanks very much.